We have scriptures from the Gospel of Mark and from the letter of James this morning. So it describes I'll read from Mark first, and it's sort of in the middle. It says, they went on from there and passed through Galilee. It describes the disciples, the 12 at this point, with Jesus, walking along. Recently, the transfiguration happened. So that's the story where Jesus sort of transfigures before the disciples and becomes like glowing. It's a significant moment. Just to understand, that was shortly before this in the gospel story. They went from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" They were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it into his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." There ends the reading from Mark. And then this is from the letter of James, verses 3 through parts of chapter 3 versus parts of the early chapter 4. Who is wise and understandable among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be arrogant and lie about the truth. This is not wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. Parentheses, I pray you do not. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Submit yourself, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you. May God bless the reading and hearing of these words to their movement in our lives today. Amen. Jesus tells them the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. There's often trash on the front lawn of my house. It's like a raised lawn, so there's a concrete wall kind of by the sidewalk. And then the grass is, I don't know, from here to Kathy, like that amount of grass. And there's often trash, like right here, right at the corner of the wall and the grass. It's like right at like my, waist height. So if I'm walking along and I have some trash, I might just drop it there. A lot of people seem to drop trash there. Natalia, my partner, will say, am I the only one who sees trash here? Am I the only one who picks up the trash here? Am I the only one who cares about the trash? Because literally she'll pick it up and then a couple hours later there's more trash. And there was just yesterday, there was just this very particular bit of trash right at the corner there. It was a couple of alcohol swab packs. And they had been opened, and the package was just there. And of course, in my sermon preparation mode, I was picturing the hands of somebody opening those packs, doing what they needed to do with the alcohol wipe, and then just leaving it there. Like their hands, opening it, tending, whatever they were doing, and then leaving the pack there. I have seen hands reach out of cars with tinted windows and drop trash as they drive down the street. Yeah. And I wonder, what's going on? Are they just, what's going on in the mind of someone whose hand is doing that? I've seen hands on a gun on someone's belt, right? In the neighborhood. You're like, what is that, right? Who are they protecting themselves from? Or what kind of violence do they anticipate incurring? Their hands in that way. Jesus is betrayed into human hands. There's the hands of that woman who started what became a meme about Haitians eating cats. She typed it into social media. She said she didn't think it was a big deal. She didn't intend it to be a big thing. But she took her hands and sat there and typed that. Why? Where was that coming from? Hands, right? Betrayed into human hands. Our human hands are capable of desecration and violence, of harm. In the story in Mark, it feels very human. It feels very familiar. I don't know. It feels very contemporary in a way. The disciples are walking with Jesus, and he tells them this thing. He tells them, I will be betrayed into human hands. And he basically says, and that I will be killed, and after 3 days, I will rise again. And the disciples don't go like, whoa, Jesus, what are you talking about? Right? They are afraid, is what we hear. We hear in the scripture, it says they were afraid to ask him questions. So they were like, they didn't understand. They were afraid, or maybe they did understand a little bit, but they didn't really want to know the answer. Like, maybe they got it. Like, when you kind of suspect the answer and you just don't ask it because you already know and you don't really want to know. And so if you don't ask it, you can pretend you don't really know. And we can be held in that kind of ignorant protection of knowing, not knowing. Oh, I didn't know. Didn't know. They were afraid to ask, and then instead of asking, they decide, oh, we know how to do this. Instead, we know how to argue over who's greater. Let's just get in an argument with one another on our way here. Let's just walk and talk and say, oh, I'm way better than you. You remember when I, wore that sweet outfit the other day? Like, cream of the crop here. We don't know what grounds they were arguing their greatness, but it likely wasn't grounds of, I have loved and served and cared for all those who have come in my way this week, or I have sought to be near and dear and close to God today. That probably wasn't the kind of arguing they were doing. But they missed a lot, right? Like their fear and the combination of their fear and their sort of ego, which we know, fear and ego, the combination of their fear and ego kind of drove the plot a lot. So the combination of their fear and ego, they lost the opportunity. They lost the opportunity to sort of engage Jesus in a different way. They kind of got lost. And beyond it being a story of these 12 dudes getting lost in their own who's greater competitive bit, we get lost in irrelevant arguments about who is greater, avoiding the God in the room, avoiding the God we are walking with. We get lost, we being individuals and we being institutions. We get lost arguing and trying to poof ourselves up, saying, well, we are greater and we are greater because look at this big building we have, because look at all this money we have, because look at all this power we have. That it's like we don't want to ask the question of the God in the middle of the room, or the God who we see in the faces of our neighbors sometime. There's a beautiful, let me admit this, I haven't read any of his books yet, but there's a beautiful author. So to be clear, I haven't read his works yet, but I have heard him speak, and I want to read all of his works now. There's a beautiful author whose name is Luis Alberto Urrea, and he's a Mexican-American. And he said in an interview I heard with him, he said, we miss each other. We miss each other. This is a little bit from the interview. The interviewer says, yeah, okay, I think this is actually what you're getting at right there. You have this experience, you've said, that at the same time people want to strengthen barriers, right? Strengthen that which divides us, strengthen barriers between us. At the same time we want to strengthen barriers, we seem to want to supersede them. And this makes us a little crazy. You said, we'd like to be able to speak to each other. We miss each other. And Urrea, the author, says, yeah, don't you think? And the interviewer says, I do, but there's something about somebody like you writing it down that way, and I read it and I know it's true. And Luis Alberto Urrea says, I do think it's true. And I think the border to me is just a metaphor. All we have to do is look around us. The border is everywhere. Look at the world we're in. Muslim ban, black and white, Black Lives Matter, gay, bi, trans, immigrants, north and south, Christian and not. Anywhere you want to go, there are these weird fences. And I can look in any audience and see fences. And so, yeah, I think we miss each other. And yeah, I've tried to train myself to be able to listen and not just react automatically. I think that goes back maybe to my theological mania too, that I just think there's a great loneliness, and I think the sacred is in almost everything. He said, we miss each other. We miss each other. The disciples were afraid to ask Jesus, what are you talking about? That you will be betrayed into human hands and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. What are you talking about, Jesus? They were afraid to see, to really have their ears open and their eyes open to see the betrayal of human hands that is often and all around. They were afraid to recognize its power of division. Hello, welcome. They were, they were afraid to be curious about that. And instead, they argued about greatness. We miss each other. We miss each other all the time. Even we here at South, we miss each other. Some of us have been side by side here in this place for years, and we still just barely know each other. We miss each other. We miss each other. Jesus said he will be betrayed into human hands. James, the other scripture, writing a letter to a community, offers this. He says, draw near to God, and God will draw near to you. Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you. It's hard to ignore what human hands do in violence. It's all around us. The author Luis Alberto Urrea, being a Mexican-American, and his writing focuses a lot on the border between the United States and Mexico. And certainly human hands have literally built a wall in portions of that, along portions of that border. And human hands have built border walls before, right? In Germany, right? We have built literal physical walls to divide us, betraying the human connection that is our birthright and calling, our foundational belonging to one another prior to and beyond nation-state borders. Human hands build borders and barriers all the time. And they also sing of resistance to those very barriers. Yes, hands can sing. Stephen Schick is a composer, conductor, and percussionist, and he did a concert on the land where the wall between Mexico and the United States was being built. And he did a concert on both sides. So there were performers in the United States and there were performers in Mexico performing at the same time the same piece of music. And it was a percussion piece of music. All of those hands were being used in service of connection, of community, of collaboration, of resistance to the labor of hands that were building a wall to represent a division. He set up American musicians on one side of the wall, Mexican musicians on the other side of the wall, and they could not see each other. He conducted, and he was on the U.S. side, and the Mexicans could watch the video of him conducting, and each side had about 300 people watching. And they did a concerto together to prove that these walls, that you can't stop art, and you can't stop human touch or connection. It flew over the wall. Or as Stephen Schick, the composer, said at the beginning, con la música non se puede dividirnos, which is with music we cannot be divided. Again, a percussionist with all those hands across the borders, these hands that were singing of something other than betrayal. They were hands that were singing of connection, that were declaiming connection, that were insisting on it, that were loud about it. Jesus urges us, receive God like children. And when you receive a child, when you see a parent receiving a child after a long day at school, they go like this, right? And they say, come to me. And your hands are like this. Your hands are like wide open and ready to receive. Receive me like little children. Open your hands and receive me. Jesus says, do this with your hands instead of betraying me. Instead of desecrating this earth, instead of dividing you from the next, instead of competing for greatness, Jesus urges, receive me like children. Take up the habits of hands of care. Those we know are our humans' hands too, even while we can read and know, and we can be brave enough to be curious enough about the betrayal that is active in our world. Okay, so differently than the disciples, we can choose to be brave enough, to be curious enough to know what we need to know about hands that are being used in service of betrayal and division and disconnection. And simultaneously, we can practice habits of hands. Yeah, it's like in the beginning of COVID when we were learning how to wash our hands. It was like we can practice habits of hand care, hand caring, that are truly godly. They are connected. They come from our rootedness in God. They nurse and tend. They receive the little children or the big children or the elders. They dead end the plants. I love watching hands dead end plants, the little flowers, so that the growth can keep coming. They create a percussive orchestra across border lands. They open up from their own roots. They pick up the trash that other people have put down. They notice the trash. When your hands are connected to the God root of our being, they are kind and gentle hands. Right? They touch the back of somebody to encourage them. They think before writing something mean or that could be used in violence. Right? When our hands are an expression of our connection with God, they are gentle and kind and impactful. Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you, James says. Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you. Notice your hands and let their work be gentleness. And God will be expressed through them. This is a bit of a side, but on the bike path the other day, I went back to the bike path, if you remember my long story about finally getting on my bike again. I was on the bike path the other day in East Hampton, and this is an ordinary thing to see, but it stood out for some reason. There was, a plant that obviously a big plant that somebody had been tending, and portions of it probably were determined to be a weed, and chunks of it were cut off from the plant. So there was like the parts that had been removed just on the side of the path, and they were brown and dry and crunchy, right? And then right next to it was the plant that was still rooted, still grounded, and it was green and soft and growing. And I know a plant metaphor is a bit of a reach to a hand description, but it's a little bit like that. When we allow ourselves, when we practice a rooting, like planting ourselves in the God earth, we are soft and green, and we have gentle hands. If we get cut off, and I know that doesn't really work, if we get cut off, because things cut us off, but when we get cut off, we can become harsh and crunchy and brittle. Right? So part of this is also just an invitation to the habit of connecting to that ground of our being. Human hands, we know, betray one another a lot. They betray creation. They participate in the extraction of goodness from this earth and do not return its nourishment to it. Human hands betray one another, creation, and in so doing betray God all the time. Human hands also resurrect and heal, They also bear hope and surely love, welcoming the child in all its incarnations. We are invited into curiosity instead of arguing over who is greater. Curiosity instead about how the holy wow of being is revealed in the words and hands and face of each neighbor stranger. How Jesus was and is pointing our way to that rooted reverence. Human hands still betray one another, and still and yet and more our human hands can receive, love, care, respect, regard, touch, and tend. Gentle, strong, and humble. We miss one another, and we can move with our hands from the suffering of disconnection into the healing of connection, into the power, the true greatness of our foundational and sacred and intended belonging to each other. Receive one another, receive Jesus in your midst as a child. Hands open, wide open, ready to care and tend and celebrate and be gentle. Let's practice good hand habits this week, folks. All right, amen.